Welcome to the Corcoran Lab Podcast, which separates fact from fiction in education and advocates for the use of high-quality research to inform evidence-based education policy and practice. I'm Roisin Corcoran, Professor and Chair in Education at the University of Nottingham. In Series 1, we're discussing social and emotional learning with leading education experts. We're also taking time to reflect on its value and importance at a time when many schools around the world are closed because of COVID-19. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two guests from the World Bank. Ezequiel Molina and Adelle Pushparatnam lead the bank's work on teacher professional development. This includes the development of the classroom observation tool Teach, which aims to capture the quality of teaching practices in classrooms around the world, and Coach, a new initiative focused on improving the quality of in-service professional development for teachers. Ezequiel, if I can start with you. An organisation like the World Bank will be doing a huge amount to support poorer, low and middle income countries with all that is going on around COVID-19 at the moment. But are you able to tell us what is the World Bank's view on how the disease is impacting education in low and middle income countries?
Our view is that building on what we've been hearing from policymakers, teachers and administrators around the countries that we work in, is that the pandemic is treating education progress worldwide through two major channels. The first is the near universal closing of schools, which will lead to learning loss, increased dropout, and higher inequality. And the second one is the economic recession sparked by the pandemic control measures, which will definitely exacerbate the damage by depressing education demand and supplies as it harms households. And together, both of these channels will have a long-run cost on human capital and welfare. But if countries are able to move quickly to support continued learning, they can mitigate the damage and even turn recovery into a new opportunity. In implementing these policies, education systems should aim to recover, but not to replicate the past, given that in many countries, the pre-COVID status quo was characterized by too little learning, high levels of inequality, and a slow progress. Countries now have an opportunity to, what we are calling at the bank, build back better. They can use the most effective crisis recovery strategies as the basis for long-term improvements in areas like assessment, pedagogy, technology, financing, and parental involvement.
Adelle, you have a particular interest in very young children and the quality of early learning environments. What are your major concerns about what's happening now? And specifically, what are you hearing from policymakers, teachers, and providers of education on the ground in the countries where you are working?
Thanks, Roisin. So there's definitely a concern that as most households and education systems prioritize continuing learning for older children, emphasis on early childhood education may decline. Children at younger ages, say between the ages of 0 to 8, are less able to use distance learning programs and tools on their own. And there are also concerns around increased screen time, for example. This is a concern because student learning is cumulative. If foundational skills are missing in the early years, this will have a knock-on effect on later learning. And beyond early learning, there are also concerns around nutrition. Families may have been relying on school feeding programs, concerns around increased domestic violence and generally more stressors at home. And we know that stress can exacerbate the negative effects of the COVID-19 situation on learning, behavior, and physical and mental health. So there are concerns around early childhood development on various fronts.
Okay, so let's put COVID-19 to one side for now. I want to ask you about the World Bank's Teach initiative and the Coach program. For those not in the know, could you just explain what these initiatives are about?
So Teach is a classroom observation tool to measure teaching practices in primary classrooms. It's intended to be a tool used for system diagnostic or for professional development. What we mean by that is, as a system diagnostic tool, Teach allows governments to monitor the effectiveness of their policies to improve teaching practices. And as a professional development tool, Teach is used to identify individual teacher strengths and weaknesses. what is specific about Teach that we think is valuable is first that Teach measures time on task and, more importantly, the quality of the teaching practice in the classroom. Second, that capture not just instructional practice that nurture children cognitive, but also socio-emotional skills. Third, that it was developed with low and middle income countries in mind and can be adapted for different settings. And lastly, that it's free to use and is currently available in over 10 languages, including English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Swahili, Russian, Chinese, etc. And it comes with a complementary host of resources that make training, data collection, and analysis easier. Identifying teacher strengths and weaknesses is a first step toward improvement, but we all know that is not enough. That is why we launched Coach at the request of many governments that, after implementing Teach, ask us, what do we do to improve teaching and learning? So Coach is a work program focused on improving in-service teaching professional development that moves away from traditional focus on inputs to focus on the impact of the quality of student-teacher interactions in the classroom.
It's important to clarify that users do not need to pay to access the Teach, including the manual, training materials, and the observation instrument itself. However, as is the case for other observation instruments, users still do incur some costs to implement the tool, including hiring trainers, raters. Some source must pay observers, pay for training, even the website, which itself needs to be maintained. Why was it important for the World Bank that users do not need to pay to access the Teach manual, training materials, and the observation instrument?
There are already existing tools, but those tools were not available in all its form, meaning there may be available the tool, but not the training material or not the some aspect that is important. And in most of the countries that we work, countries don't have the resources to actually pay for that cost. So this not only democratize the use of classroom observation tools, but also allow us to improve, because what we see now is that countries, NGOs, universities are using the tool and they are finding issues and they are trying to improve. And I think as a whole, this allows us to collaborate in a much broader scale and learn from what works and adapt it to the different contexts.
And so, Adelle, initiatives to help educators spring up all the time. But I'm keen to know what the evidence behind these ideas are. And can you talk us through why these initiatives, why now, and also why the World Bank?
We are in the midst of a learning crisis, and this is one that existed even before COVID-19 hit. Data highlight that half of all children in low and middle income countries are not able to read a simple text by age 10, a condition that the World Bank has termed learning poverty. Further, at current rates of improvement, only 6 in 10 of the children around the world will be able to do so by 2030, setting up the international community to fall extremely short on ensuring quality education for all, which is what Sustainable Development Goal 4.1 is all about. The bank recently launched a new learning target to cut the learning poverty rate by at least half by 2030. For this goal to be achieved, support to teachers has to be a part of the strategy, because the global learning crisis is at its core a teaching crisis. Teachers are the most important school-based factor for student learning. However, education systems often do not set teachers up to be successful. For example, most countries do not regularly nor adequately monitor teaching to identify professional development needs. And without data on what goes on in the classroom, it is difficult for policymakers and school leaders to recognize challenges that teachers may be facing and to identify ways to support them. This was the impetus for Teach, as I also mentioned above. Now, with Teach launched, countries have data on teachers' use of effective teaching practices in the classroom. And there has been a growing demand from countries for resources to improve the quality of their in-service teacher professional development to help improve teachers' use of effective teaching practices in the classroom. We have evidence showing that countries currently spend millions of dollars on teacher professional development with an average of zero effect on learning outcomes. And this is really the emphasis for COACH, to think about how we could address this issue.
A lot of my work and our work with colleagues has focused on this idea of high quality, continuous professional development, and really a much greater emphasis on developing the social and emotional competence of teachers, and especially beginning teachers. So is there potential for this work to be used in pre-service teacher education and kind of throughout the continuum as teachers develop these important skill sets?
Yes, we definitely see the importance of also working on pre-service teacher professional development. The reason why we started with a focus on in-service is because we see that this is the way to more quickly move the needle on what's happening in classrooms today. In a lot of these countries that we work in, there is a huge, what we call stock of teachers that are currently in classrooms that need to teach students tomorrow. And so this is where we're focusing our efforts for now and thinking about how to support teachers both in terms of teaching academic content, but also in supporting social and emotional learning, as we think that that will lead to quicker results. But at the same time, we want to align these efforts with what's going on in pre-service and to make sure that there's a continuum or continuity through pre-service and in-service teacher professional development.
Can you talk us through what the Teach tool aims to capture and how it is actually used in a classroom setting?
So Teach has two components. One to measure the share of time the teacher provides the students with learning activities, called time on task. And the second one measures the quality of teaching practices. So as part of the time on task component, a series of snapshots are used to record whether the teacher provides a learning activity and the number of students who are on task. The second part, the quality of teaching practices component, is organized in three primary areas: classroom culture, instruction, and socio-emotional skills. These areas have 9 corresponding elements that point to 28 behaviors. These behaviors are characterized by low, medium, and high based on the evidence collected during the observation. These behavior scores are then translated into a 5-point scale that quantifies teaching practices. So classroom culture measures whether the teacher creates a culture that is conducive to learning by treating students respectfully, responding to their needs, challenging gender stereotypes, setting clear expectations, and redirecting misbehavior, focusing on what the students should do rather than what they don't. Instruction measures whether the teacher instructs in a way that deepens student understanding and encourages critical thinking and analysis. And finally, socio-emotional skills measure whether the teacher instills autonomy by providing a student with choices to approach tasks and allow students to take meaningful roles in the classroom. It also measures whether the teacher promotes student efforts and helps students understand that failure and frustration are normal part of the learning process. Finally, it measures whether the teacher fosters a collaborative classroom environment.
We don't have time to go into detail on all aspects of the Teach tool, but perhaps you could give us one clear example of how it works.
Let me give an example of checking for student understanding, which is one of the most important practices effective teachers do as part of instruction. We all been in a classroom, either as a student or, sometimes ourselves as teachers, where the teacher asks a question like, is everyone following along? Everyone responding a resounding yes, even if they are not following along, and the lesson carry on. Alternatively, when the teacher asks a question, only the students in the front row raise their hands. One of them answers the question correctly, and the lesson continues. However, we know that those who raise the hand are not a representative sample of students. Rather, they are those who are more likely to know the answer. By asking students to raise their hand, the teacher may think everyone understands when this is not the case. This also happens when the teacher asks a student, does everyone understand? A student will rarely admit they don't understand. How something that we all recognize happening in classrooms translates into how we measure in Teach. So one of the 3 behaviors of checking for understanding, we look at whether the teacher uses questions, prompts, or other strategies to determine a student level of understanding. The teacher that uses is everyone following along a strategy as the only way to check for understanding, we'll get a low in the tool. Medium, when the teacher only asks a few students, for example, those in the front row. And high, when the teacher checks student understanding of most students. And the other two behaviors, we also look at whether the teacher monitors students during independent and group work, and whether the teacher adjusts teaching to the level of the students in the classroom, rather than, again, following with the curriculum. What we hope is that teach allows to have a common languages to talk about teaching practices, which transform anecdotal examples like the one I was saying before to actionable data that teachers can use to improve what they do in the classroom.
Okay, and so that's great. It gives us a good overview of the tool itself. So it's an observation measure. So who can serve as an observer in the classroom, and what kind of training do those observers need to go through in order to be certified or to use the Teach tool in the classroom?
If the goal of the data is for system diagnostic, so to have an idea of teaching practices in the country or in the area that we are doing this study, to then think about how we can improve pre- and in-service teacher training. We work either with government staff or a firm that provides enumerators or observers. So those observers usually don't have a background in education. If it is government staff, they usually do. For the purpose of applying the tool, what does matter is taking our training. Teach training is a 4-day training and then an exam. We explain the elements in detail and watch lots of clips of classrooms of the particular country. Observers try to understand specifically how to map the behaviors that they have in the manual with what they observe in the classroom. And then they spend day 2 and day 3 mostly observing videos of classrooms in the particular country that we're working and coding. And once they do that, then we go through the process of looking at their codes and checking those with codes developed by the Teach team, expert team, that already have seen the videos, discussed the videos, and agree on what are the scores for the different elements. Through that process is that they learn how to code. And then what we also do is we go out to schools where we also do a pilot, so they get a sense of how it looks in the ground, discuss with the teachers, make sure that this is a voluntary use of the tool, get the proper consents, etc. We come back. They do have an exam, and they need to score correctly 80% of the time. They have to be within one of these master codes that we were talking before. If they do that, they are certified to then be able to observe classroom. And if they don't, they are not.
This is obviously such an important initiative. And I think, the Teach seems to have a number of key strengths. One is it captures the context, the kind of local context of the classroom. 2 is obviously it's a free open source measure, and all of the training that you would need for observers to go into the classroom, that's all available free also. But how do we know, and we talk a little bit on this podcast about making sure that assessments and the measures that we use are what we might call psychometrically sound. So they're valid, they're reliable. So talk to us a little bit about the work that you've been doing with the Teach to make sure that these measures are actually sound and capturing what they say they're meant to capture.
Many of the current available tools that countries that low and middle income countries use are actually not psychometrically valid and have not undergone any testing. We look at first reliability, that is whether the different observers observing the same classroom get the same results. We see that 90% of the time, observers that go through the training are able to become reliable in the tool. And that is one piece of evidence. But also what we see is that when we look at reliability in the field, meaning when they go out to the classrooms to do the data collection, we put 2 observers to code independently in those classrooms. We also found high levels of reliability. And we find that only 4% of the variation in the score is due to raters. So that's the first point. Then the second part of looking at validity is to look at whether the tool is correlated to things like student outcomes or things that we know matter for classroom quality. And we have done a study in Pakistan. When we look at those things, we see the expected correlations between better classroom quality as measured by Teach and student scores. We also look at the amount of information that the tool provides, and we look at the different elements that provide that information within the tool. And we did that through the process of the piloting to make sure that all the elements that were part of the tool were producing enough information, and the ones that weren't, we either revise or drop. I think something that we acknowledge is that psychometric properties are not a property of the tool, but are a property of the application. And by that means that the fact that the tool has been found to be reliable and valid to use in Punjab, Pakistan, doesn't mean that it will be reliable and valid in Argentina. When we develop all these resources, we develop one additional resource that compute all these psychometric properties in order, for the different applications. So when someone else is doing a new application in a new country, they could run this program and see whether the tool is actually psychometrically valid for that particular implementation.
And so I understand that the coach program is at an earlier stage of development. But Adelle, could you tell us what the vision for this initiative is?
Coach is a work program focused on improving in-service teacher professional development, moving away from a traditional focus on input, like procuring laptops, for example, to a focus on the impact on the quality of student-teacher interactions in the classroom. The Coach work program will involve the development of global public goods and resources that governments and other stakeholders can use to improve in-service teacher professional development in their context, as well as in-country work that the Coach team will engage in that will also inform the development of these global public goods. Coach will be focused around a set of key evidence-based principles with the overall goal of improving student-teacher interactions in the classroom. First, what we see from the existing literature and evidence of what works is that high-quality in-service teacher professional development needs to be tailored to teachers' needs. So just as effective teaching should include adjusting to the learning needs of students, similarly, effective professional development should be targeted to the areas in which teachers need the most support. Second, it must be practical, not just theoretical. We see that traditional professional development tends to be lecture-based, with teachers participating simply as passive listeners. But evidence indicates that active learning strategies which involve hands-on application are much more successful in improving learning and retention. Third, it must be focused. So teacher professional development needs to be selective and strategic in scope, rather than trying to cover everything and anything. And finally, it must be ongoing, because we know that one-off professional development is not effective. Teachers need to receive continuous support over a sustained period to ensure that new skills and knowledge are properly consolidated and internalized. So ultimately, the vision is that teachers receive tailored, focused, practical, and ongoing support, which would then lead to teacher-student interactions, to improve teacher-student interactions in the classroom, so that teachers feel supported and fulfilled in their careers and student learning outcomes improve. That's the vision for this Coach program.
And so this series of our podcast is focused on social and emotional learning. So how is this built into the Teach and Coach initiatives? And why do you think the World Bank is so interested in social and emotional learning?
We think the evidence clearly shows that social and emotional learning are as important as cognitive learning in predicting health, academic, labor, and other life outcomes. And while a clear distinction is often made between the two are closely intertwined, so that improving learning outcomes also requires a focus on social and emotional learning, and vice versa. This is why, as Eze mentioned before, we have an area focused specifically on social-emotional skills in Teach. While some may argue that having an area specifically focused on social-emotional skills perpetuates this false dichotomy between cognitive learning and social and emotional learning, we have found that having this be an explicit area of the tool has helped increase awareness about the importance of social and emotional learning in the classroom and has helped drive policy dialogue around supporting teachers to promote social and emotional learning in their students. This is why within Coach as well, we will include an emphasis on whole child development and include a focus on how to support teachers to promote social and emotional learning in their students. For example, teachers could be provided with strategies for how to respond positively to students' mistakes in the classroom, or strategies for how to promote inter-student collaboration. We think this is as important as providing teachers with strategies for checking students' understanding or promoting critical thinking, for example.
And so in terms of providing that kind of professional development, so in line with, we'll say, the Teach tool, specifically around social and emotional learning, how is that professional development, what's that going to look like in the Coach, and who's going to provide that kind of training? What are the kinds of social and emotional competence that the coaches might need themselves? So have you thought about that as you move this work forward?
These are questions that we are actively working through right now. In terms of how this could look within a professional development program, what we could see, for example, is that teachers could receive coaching sessions that are focused on specific skills that they could use in the classroom, kind of linked to this idea that we mentioned earlier, the principle of it being focused. And so we could have some coaching sessions focused on more content-focused or academic-focused strategies like checking for understanding, as I mentioned. But we could also allocate certain sessions to be focused on elements that are more targeted at social and emotional learning. In terms of who would be carrying out these coaching sessions or who would be supporting teachers, that's a question that we've seen would vary quite a lot from context to context, because it really depends on how the structure is set up. So there's not one answer across the board. In some cases, the person that's best placed to support teachers could be the school principal. In another context, it could be inspectors within the school system. And in other cases, it could even be peer-to-peer teacher support. And so the question of who is not one that we have a fixed answer to, but we think that's going to vary depending on where we're working. And the question of whether the coaches themselves need to have social and emotional competencies, I think that is something that we're definitely investigating further and thinking about how we can go about the selection as well as the training of coaches to make sure that they are well placed to then support teachers to promote social and emotional learning in the classroom.
The scale and potential of this project is enormous. What have been some of the key challenges in terms of policy, research and practice, would you both say?
There is a relative lack of research in low and middle income countries on effective teaching practices. Most of the evidence does come from developed countries. And even this evidence sometimes is not specific enough. By this, I mean, for example, there are a lot of randomized controlled trials on many topics, but in this area, there are not randomized controlled trials on different strategies to check for student understanding, for example. In order to develop the tool, we have to use the evidence as much as we can, but also we have to use other strategies. What we did was 3 different methods to try to get around this. The first was grounding the evidence by examining videos of different countries in low and middle income countries to make sure that the content of the tool was applicable. Second, we include local stakeholders in the development process and also in the subsequent implementations of the tool. And finally, we use information from the pilot on how the tool was working in Uruguay, Philippines, and Pakistan and Mozambique in order to improve it. Another issue was convincing policymakers that this tool is better used for professional development and not for accountability. And at the same time, convincing teachers that this tool was not going to be used to punish individual teachers, but to improve the support they receive. For example, we have been in countries where they would say the last time teachers were observed in the classroom was during the military dictatorship and was to try to censor the content of what they were teaching the students. So, of course, breaking those barriers is not easy. And trying to understand that something that in the past was used to punish now could be used to support and strengthen what teachers do is not an easy process, but it takes time. Once we start showing the results and when we start showing that it can be used for support, I think the different stakeholders appreciate that the power of teaching in that sense. And third, convincing stakeholders that it's worth implementing a high inference tool at scale, despite the resources that are involved in training. So showing the value added of going from the yes-no tools that are not psychometrically valid to something like Teach that gives you a bigger picture of what's going in the classroom, but it will cost resources and money to train people to do it.
And Roisin, if I could add on 2 additional challenges that I also see. One is the wide variation in systems that we work in. And here, for example, I'm thinking from the coach perspective, as I mentioned earlier, it's not always clear who the coach should be in a system, for example. And similarly, while we talk about coaches and while the program is called Coach, because we see that this is the end goal that we're working towards, is coaching programs are really the ones that best embody the 4 principles that we talked about. There are many systems that we work in that just aren't built to implement a coaching system in the near future. There are lots of different steps that need to be taken in working towards building a coaching support system for teachers. So the work that we're doing in Coach as well focuses on how we can improve existing in-service teacher professional development initiatives. So in some cases, we might start off by working on improving group training sessions for teachers. And while the ideal might be, having a coach visit a teacher every month or so, we can also see value in improving group training that teachers might be receiving once a quarter, for example. So, there's a challenge in the wide variation that we see, and so coming up with one protocol is difficult, but at the same time, we see an opportunity to help move the needle in the right direction and to meet countries and systems where they are. The second challenge that I wanted to flag is, as we've been trying to build on existing evidence of what works in teacher professional development, a challenge that we've been finding is in getting information about these programs and also getting the relevant materials associated with these programs. And this is tied to your earlier question of why we see the importance of making these tools and resources open source or freely available, because if it's hard to get access to what currently exists, then the only way forward is to reinvent the wheel. So this is something that we're trying very hard to avoid doing, because we know that there's already been a lot of great work done out there in service teacher professional development and teacher professional development as a whole. And we really want to build on that. So I could also, if we could, we'd also like to use this opportunity to use this as a call for anyone who has examples of teacher professional development programs that they know have been effective in different contexts. And if they're willing to share materials from teacher professional development, we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to have a look at those materials so that, again, we can build on them and make sure that we're not doing work that has already been done elsewhere.
I think one question that at least I and I think many others get from policymakers is around this issue of selection versus preparation. And I think you're hitting off this in terms of who the coach should be, but it often comes up in terms of teacher selection and preparation. Can we just select on those characteristics that might predict who's going to be a good teacher? And I suppose if we could, then policymakers might position their resources and even, create policies that would focus on that selection piece. I guess one of the challenges around that is, we have a lot of gaps in the data that we collect that would even allow us to address that question in a very rigorous way. So there's kind of a gap in the evidence base around selection and what characteristics you would select for, and does that lead to improved teaching and ultimately improved student learning. The second challenge, I suppose, is that it undermines the assumption of teacher preparation, which is that we can prepare great teachers. And so how we can do that in an evidence-based way that essentially prepares teachers, prepares coaches to be effective and ultimately to lead to student outcomes. So, where should we be focusing our efforts right now, and where does the evidence lie in terms of those questions? I do want to just pick up on one point, Ezequiel, you mentioned, which was around, the need for evidence. And when we think about the coach in particular, this seems to be now, a program approach to improving, quality of teaching. So should we expect in the near future to see this entire approach going through randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental designs, generating that real high quality evidence to make sure that this is working?
We feel like there is not enough evidence on all these things, on how, first, which are the practices that matter the most, and then how you enhance the professional development to get teachers to actually model those practices. And I think that there are some evidence that there's been new research on this topic. At least I'm aware of a couple of randomized controlled trials trying to use some of these ideas. For example, testing some of the ideas behind the science of learning, of whether some of those techniques that have been found in the literature to be effective theoretically, when you do it through a randomized controlled trial, you get better results or not. That should be the sort of parameter that we should use to then advocate for these different practices. I just feel like there is a big agenda for research on this, on becoming much more specific about what we say works, and then trying to see if it works on different contexts or what works in different contexts. So I definitely think that there is an untapped potential for how we can use this data to inform policy.
Teach celebrated its first birthday in January, and I was delighted to be invited to be part of the celebrations in Washington, D.C., where you shared some of the major successes to date, and we discussed some of the ways forward. So what exactly have been achieved to date?
The idea of the launch was to showcase some of the things that we have been doing in this past year. So we have been very lucky to work with over 30 countries to contextualize and apply the tool, from China to Tanzania, from Uruguay to Pakistan. So when looking back at the last year, I think we have three main lessons. It is possible to apply a high inference tool in low and middle income countries. As we said before, many low and middle income countries use checklists to measure teaching practice. For example, they would have the teacher check for a student understanding or not. But questions like, are they following along, would have qualified as yes, in the same way as actually asking a real question to check for a student understanding. So I think the fact that we show that you can go beyond the yes or no and still be reliable, that was definitely a lesson for us. Then the second lesson is that time spent teaching is very different than quality teaching. So when teachers are in the school and in the classroom, we found that across countries, they use more than 80% of the time, of the class time on task, providing students with learning activities. However, the use of that time is highly inefficient, as we see that less than 30% of the teachers score above 3 out of the 5 in the teach overall score. And the third lesson, and our biggest surprise, is the lowest scores on traditional instructional practices. So we observed two main findings across countries. The first is that teachers always score higher on classroom culture than instruction. And lastly, instilling socio-emotional skills in students. This is something we expected, as most teachers don't get trained on how to instill students socio-emotional skills. We also expected to find lower scores on critical thinking. However, our surprise was to find relatively low score on common teaching practices, like lesson facilitation, checking for understanding, providing meaningful feedback to students, which one would imagine should be emphasized continuously during pre and in service. That's also take us to think, when thinking about coach, how to also prioritize the teaching skills that teachers need the most. Maybe those are not the ones at the lowest, but the ones that we suppose that it should be, it should be something that they are doing very well. But when you actually look at it, these are basic fundamental teaching practices for which some teachers still struggle.
And so as you mentioned, the celebrations and the recorded panel discussions, which of course are available on YouTube and on the World Bank's website, it was absolutely full of optimism and hope for the future. But that optimism must be rather shattered by the events surrounding COVID-19. Where do you both see things going from here? Is it back to square one, or can you still build on what's been achieved?
So there definitely has been some adjustment needed in response to COVID-19, but we wouldn't say that our optimism has been shattered. We're working to think through how the work we've done so far can be deployed under current circumstances. For example, through remote learning targeted at teachers rather than at students, as well as how it may need to be adjusted for post-COVID-19 realities as schools reopen and systems focus on building back better, as we mentioned right at the beginning. The challenges around the learning crisis were formidable even before COVID-19, and that didn't stop us from stepping up to the plate. Now they're even more formidable, but to us, this just emphasizes the need for an initiative like Coach both during the COVID-19 situation and also once schools reopen, as we think now more than ever, teachers need to be supported.
So as we think about this work going forward in terms of the teach and the subdomains, so in terms of teacher quality and teacher effectiveness and also social and emotional competence, the fact that you're using this tool across many countries, should we expect, or is it based on an assumption that there are kind of these broad set of universal competencies that are common across many countries and across different contexts?
So far, we can't really tell because there is no way to measure. By putting a measure out there and trying to prioritize things that we think make sense, looking at the evidence, looking at the videos, talking to local stakeholders that are important everywhere, we feel like we are advancing the discussion. So the discussion is not just on what people think, but what the evidence says. And what we've done with the current data that we have is actually trying to test this discussion by looking at whether one can see the different elements that we have in one country work in the same way in the different countries that we applied. And the result is that neither group, the ones that think that best effective teaching practices are endogenous to the culture of a given country, or the ones that think like the same teaching practices work across country, are actually right. For some teaching practices, we see that they work across countries, and for others, we see that they work better in one country, but maybe not so well in the other. The whole point of Teach is that it's allowing us to have this, evidence and allowing us to improve as time goes by. Like, okay, how we can make the tool better? What are the sort of things that make Check for Understanding work across cultures, but not some of the other practices, and be every time more specific. What I should say that in the tool, we have things like the teacher effectively check for understanding, but we don't look at a specific strategy. There may be different strategies to do this. So there is still that component that is not scripted in the tool, and that can vary across cultures. But still, I think the biggest value that I see is the opportunity to collect more data, to be able to do more research. So from 10 years from now, when people keep asking this question, because they will keep asking the same question, we have more evidence to answer the question rather than go back to either everything is endogenous or everything should work for every country.
Absolutely. I think that's great in terms of just building those complex databases that we can begin to explore some of these important questions further is extremely valuable. I guess all that remains for me is to thank you both very much indeed for being our guests today on this episode of the Corcoran Lab Podcast.
Roisin Corcoran was talking with Ezequiel Molina and Adelle Pushparatnam from the World Bank for this episode of the Corcoran Lab Podcast, which was produced by Chris Garrington. You can find out more about the work of the Corcoran Lab at www.corcoran-lab.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get forthcoming episodes as soon as they're released, and do join in the conversation with Roisin on Twitter at Dr. R. Corcoran. Our podcast is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Opinions and recommendations are those of the guests and not necessarily the funder.